Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Robert Daly. Robert is director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. So guess what we're going to be talking about? China. Robert, welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be back.
So, we'll start with most recent headlines and work our way back to some other big stories emanating from the People's Republic. And of course, we just concluded earlier in the week the first summit, official summit between the two leaders, President Xi and President Biden. Talk to us about expectations heading in versus outcomes coming out.
Well, they were consistent, which is to say they were very low in each case. The American side in particular, but China as well, said beforehand that we weren't looking for deliverables or a joint statement or really to move the dial very much on any one issue. There seemed to be a desire to arrest continuing free fall in the relationship. And in particular, there's been concern, I think, on both sides for different reasons about the chance for a real conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And Biden and Xi have met twice this year, have had two phone calls this year. This was their first face-to-face meeting. The American side was careful not to call it a summit. The Chinese side did. Most of the media have called it a summit. But America, to lower expectations, said, no, they're just talking. And they did talk for about 3.5 hours, including about Taiwan. And I think the way to regard it is not as a breakthrough, not as a reset, but as a small, good step that puts perhaps a little bit of a floor under the relationship for now, if they can build on it. The more they talk, the better. The less expectation that they have a breakthrough, the better as well.
One outcome that is, well, not measurable, certainly noticeable, is an intangible. It's tone, right? It was ratcheted down. We didn't hear the hyperbole that we've been subjected to in recent months. And both men calling each other old friend or something of that nature. Does tone matter? Or maybe I should ask you, how much does tone matter?
Tone matters greatly to the Chinese side, more to them than to us, although it matters to us as well. The old friend question is an interesting one. For diplomats who deal with China regularly, they hate being called an old friend of China because while the Chinese side will tell you that this is purely, affectionate and friendly, it tends to be received as somewhat manipulative. The deal for being an old friend of China seems to be that you never place any obstacles in its way and never object to what it does. So that right before the meeting, actually Biden, through Jen Psaki, said, we're not old friends. We've met each other many times, we work together, but he rejected that notion that we are old friends. I think the reason being that if he said we were old friends, he was going to get blowback from the right, especially in the Senate. Senators Rubio and Hawley, Senator Cotton, Senator Cruz are all highly critical of the Biden administration's approach to China. In fact, Senator Rubio just put a very late hold on Nicholas Burns going out to China as the ambassador. So I think that he was careful to say, I'm not an old friend before the summit. And then Xi Jinping came in with a big smile and opened up with, my dear, good old friend, it's wonderful to see you. So there was a little bit of back and forth there. But the tone is that
gamesmanship on Xi's part, or is that just a culture? Okay.
No. This was very clear. She wants to tell the Chinese people that he is an old friend. But President Biden, I think, like Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, like Secretary Blinken, is trying to set a tone that is firm and clear, but not gratuitously insulting. And China did feel regularly and deliberately insulted under the previous administration, and that made it very hard for them to work with us, frankly.
So how did it play at home? I'm always interested in your take on the coverage from the Chinese media.
It played as a victory and a validation of a patient, stubborn policy on the part of Xi Jinping. In the Chinese readouts, they were very careful to say that the American side had requested this meeting. That's a big point one. It makes it sound to the Chinese people as though the United States needs us more than we need them. The Chinese side was the first to announce that there was going to be some relaxation in issuing visas for journalists from both countries. But in making that announcement, it was very clear that the American side would relax first, let some Chinese journalists in, as the Chinese described this, and then China would take a look at it. And so this was presented as a victory. Now, of course, these statements after the meetings are always to be read with a great deal of salt. I was struck that not only on the Chinese side, but on the American side as well, all of the readouts including Jake Sullivan's readout the day after. He gave a public talk at the Brookings Institute about this. And his readout of the meeting was all about what Biden said, And of course, what you really want to know coming out of these meetings is, what did Biden hear? What did he think? Did anything that he heard cause him to rethink? Of course, this is what you want to know about Xi Jinping as well. So these readouts never touch on that. They're always declarative, sort of chest out. And certainly both men's statements of their interests and concerns to the other contained nothing new. We very boldly told Xi things that he's been hearing for several years, and he did the same with us.
Given all of this, the low expectations going in and the low outcomes coming out, and nothing new, as you just put it, was there still a sense of urgency for this meeting to happen now because of the mounting tension over Taiwan and the increasing chatter about potential military conflict?
I think so. Both within some quarters in China and the United States, there is a sense that the chances of us entering into a conflict over Taiwan have gone up. Many in the United States think that that might come as early as 2025 or 2027. From China's point of view, they have heard America moving further and further away from the spirit of the one China policy as we test its limits with more visits from senators, with more military cooperation, more military sales. From our point of view, we see Xi Jinping having indirectly articulated a timetable for reunification, no later than 2049, it is thought. And China has been running more and more bombers and fighters and surface vessels into the area around Taiwan. And this can only be interpreted as threatening. So yes, there was a need to arrest that. Xi Jinping wants smooth sailing between now and a meeting in late 2022. He wants smooth sailing through the Beijing Olympics in February. And so both sides actually needed to arrest this unguided sense that the relationship was deteriorating.
So, Robert, in preparation to speak with you, I always jot down some notes in the form of essentially an outline, prompts for myself. I don't know if they make sense to anyone else. And one of my outline points today is Xi's ascension, that was my shorthand to myself. What do you think of that? Is that an accurate way to describe what happened a week prior to the meeting between Xi and Biden? Is it a mythical ascension?
Yeah. Well, he ascended, of course, first in 2012. And he's been continually reanointed at ever higher levels since. So what happened in China last week was that for only the third time in its history, the Chinese Communist Party rewrote history. Mao Zedong did it once, Deng Xiaoping did it once. And both of those rewritings were extremely consequential. They set the table for what each leader wanted to do going forward. While they're writing history, they're not really looking back, they're looking forward.
And so he's a revered leader, is the terminology.
He's a revered leader. He's a core leader. He may even be the generator of what they call great thought, 伟大思想, which has been attributed to nobody since Mao Zedong. And it means that the Shiist catechism, Shiist views of history, Shiist slogans and platitudes and policies are absolutely beyond question and beyond critique. It's not a Maoist type of personality cult. There isn't that kind of adulation yet, but we're starting to see a resurrection of the kind of purple prose that was used to describe Mao's greatness and his centrality to China. So it is quite clear that Xi Jinping, at least as of our discussion today, can remain the preeminent leader in China for as long as he wants to.
Is there a Western equivalent that would help us understand the significance of this? It feels as if you're building the Jefferson Memorial while Thomas Jefferson is still in office.
Well, yes, but there is, I think, notably, thankfully, not a great Western model for this, certainly not on the scale that is represented by what Xi is doing in China. In smaller countries, I'm sure that there are probably analogs. But no, he is now unquestionable, and he continues to crack down within China. He's using the Maoist playbook. We've spoken about this before. It's not just the human rights issues that we hear about all the time, Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong. It's that lawyers, free speech, the media, think tanks, universities, always highly political in China, have been more deeply politicized than at any time since Mao Zedong died. He is also hunkering down economically. He's building out the surveillance state. Now, what's strange about this, with this rewriting of history, is that Xi Jinping made his bid some 5 years ago for global leadership when he spoke at Davos before President Trump was inaugurated. He made it very clear that China thinks its success now entitle it to be one of the major shapers of global norms, if not the shaper of global norms. But now he's doing these things at home that most of the rest of the world finds odious. And there's a consistent domestic, from Xi's point of view, a consistent explanation for why he's doing what he's doing domestically. But it doesn't jive well with the claim to global leadership. And they seem not to have thought through how this domestic clamping down was going to affect China's reach for leadership. So there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance there.
Is that a miscalculation, a lack of understanding of what would cause that?
So this is one of the big questions: is that, is Xi Jinping so confident, and if so, with justification or without justification, or is he so blinkered and uninformed because he's surrounded himself with a very small, tight coterie that doesn't bring him any bad news? I think that there is considerable evidence that he moved too soon and overreached. He's seen considerable blowback internationally. The AUKUS deal came about because of his extreme economic coercion of Australia. The Quad has been strengthened because of his mobilizations on the Indian border. NATO is now talking about a Chinese mission for that organization for the first time ever because of the pressures that Europe feels. It's not because we're so convincing. It's because Xi has been so threatening. So there's considerable blowback, and it shows up in international opinion polls as well, a sense that he may well have overreached. And now he's very busy shoring up domestically and is increasingly constrained, even as he's become this hallowed leader. So how does this play out?
Running with this comparison and contrast model of looking at the West and versus China, when a Western politician, when President Biden is elected, there's always a desire to claim a mandate and then to move quickly while you have majorities. So in Biden's case, we see it on infrastructure because you never know what's going to happen in the midterm elections, right? How does it play out in China now that Xi is essentially president for life, if he chooses to be that? Does it make him more bold or more patient?
Excellent question. Right now, after the Biden-Xi summit, it looks like China is about to go on a charm offensive for the coming year. They see an opportunity here to use this meeting to change the global bad China narrative, to have a somewhat smoother Olympics in Beijing in February, despite all of the concerns about its treatment of the Uyghurs. He would like to keep that smooth glide path all the way into the real anointing late next year that makes him leader for life. So in the short term, it may make him a little bit more patient. In the long term, it will depend on what sorts of signals he gets from the Chinese economy, from the people, and the rest of the world. He has created, in accruing all this power to himself, a single point of failure in the Chinese system. There is no number two really at his elbow that he can blame if things go wrong. It's all on him now. So in this system, as he accumulates ever more power, there's some senses in which he's also ever more vulnerable. His pattern to date has been to respond to that through seeking ever greater power and through insisting on silence throughout the rest of the country. So that's not a clear answer to your very, very well-placed question. A lot of it will depend on factors that Xi himself cannot necessarily control, and some of it will depend on the United States and our diplomacy.
And then, of course, life happens when you're making other plans. Global pandemics, things come up, and so you never know what the context will be. One of the ongoing questions I've been asking you for years is to sort of characterize the current state of affairs between the two countries. I won't repeat myself and ask another version of that, but I do have a sort of variation on that theme. We're always hamstrung by the old model being applied to the present. So the Cold War paradigm is always invoked when we talk about U.S.-China relations. But I'd like you to talk about, Robert, if you could educate us on what's the difference between what the Soviets intended in spreading their ideology and their influence versus what China's goals are, where I sense that we're not talking about any one-to-one equivalent here.
No, I don't think we are. The Soviets were explicitly and consistently looking to essentially Sovietize the world through the Comintern. It was a very clear vision that this was the way that society should be organized, and it was their job to convince other countries or force other countries to adopt that kind of system. That's really not what China's about. To put it perhaps a little bit too crudely, China doesn't care enough about the rest of the world to mind what sort of system it has. As long as China gets what it wants for its own continued development, and it still needs a great deal from the rest of the world. It needs to import energy and food and raw materials. It needs foreign markets. It needs foreign technology. It needs access to the global information sphere. And it's really not trying to change other countries. As long as it can get its imports and get access to markets from other countries without being insulted or criticized and without any big obstacles placed in its way, then I think China really doesn't care whether those countries are democratic or communist or anything in between, because it is far more self-regarding and self-directed in that sense than the Soviet Union was.
Which, if following along with this line of logic, that would seem to make the United States' response that much more complex and nuanced and not as easy a galvanizing point.
Yes, except that, as I said, China wants to get what it wants without, and I've said this to you before, I think, without obstacle and without objection. Mm-hmm. It insists on that. And its insistence on no critical views of China, no alternate readings of Chinese history, that is only going to strengthen with this new historical resolution that the party has passed. They simply cannot countenance any blowback, any debate, any argument, any laughing at nonsense. That's absolutely anathema. And so what this means is, that China does tend to come to other countries asking for things that it wants, some of which may be perfectly reasonable, and some of which other countries may actually want to give, but it does so in a very heavy-handed way. This is the wolf warrior diplomacy piece. And because they can't countenance any objection, what it means is that if you want to deal with China in a way that China thinks is beneficial to you economically, and if you have a free press, you have to silence it. If you have a vibrant civil society, you have to staunch it. So this ends up being sort of an indirect exportation of ideology, even though China doesn't aim at it in the first instance. Because of its ideas about the respect China is due, it ends up insisting that other countries at least behave as though they see things the Communist Party's way. And that's offensive to the free world, and some of it that isn't so free.
What drives that what appears to be almost a thin-skinned attitude toward any disagreement? Is that some sort of inferiority complex that might go away as China begins to hit its stride more and more? Or is it something more deeply ingrained in the culture?
Well, there are books and practically encyclopedia written to try to answer this question. I think the best book is still Lucian Pai's The Spirit of Chinese Politics, the late Lucian Pai at MIT. And answering would require a history lesson that we don't have time for, but I think one thing that's useful to remember was that China's first experience of negotiation and even diplomacy in the modern sense, its first experience was had under duress. It was because the West, after the Opium War, Japan were exploiting China. So China sees foreign affairs, if it's not dictating them through a sort of a tribute system, hierarchy, it sees them as inherently dangerous. And so it tends to have a rather paranoid style. That's a very simple answer to a very important, complex question.
So, Robert, where do we go from here? Are there opportunities that emerge that would be clear follow-up opportunities to the meeting between Xi and Biden?
There are. First, some kind of dialogue mechanism, hopefully not merely a dialogue followed up with action, coming out of Glasgow, COP26. Where the two sides managed at the last minute to have a symbolic common cause. That would be very helpful. And then perhaps coming out of this, there's been talk that we would have strategic stabilization talks, which would include talks about nuclear weapons. And this is absolutely essential. And I hope and assume that the Biden administration is going to drive at this one very, very hard, because China is building up its military rapidly. It is increasing its number of nuclear weapons and perhaps changing its nuclear doctrines in ways that should be of concern not only to us, but to the whole world. And so we need to begin those dialogues right away. I think we need to be patient. I don't think we should push for results immediately there, or China will back off. But that, I think, is probably the single most important thing that may come out of this summit.
Thanks, Robert. And thanks to all of you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.